The morning of the 11th of April, 1945, came grey over the Harz mountains of central Germany. The war in Europe had only weeks left to run, and the men of the American First Army knew it. They had learned by then the particular rhythm of a country collapsing. The white sheets hung from windows, the abandoned roadblocks, the silence of towns that no longer wished to fight. So when the soldiers approached the town of Nordhausen that morning, they expected another quiet surrender. They did not expect what was waiting in the hills above it. You should understand, first, that these were not historians or investigators. They were tired young men in mud-stiff uniforms, many of them barely out of their teens. They had been told only to advance. No one had told them what lay beneath the mountain called the Kuhnstein. The first sign was the smell. It reached them before the gates did, a smell that the survivors of that day would never quite manage to describe and never manage to forget. What they found in Nordhausen has been recorded in official reports, in photographs, in the testimony of the men themselves. Inside a camp on the edge of town lay thousands of bodies. The dead and the barely living were stacked together, indistinguishable. The Americans had stumbled into the outer ring of something called Mittelwerk, and they did not yet know what it was for. Then they went into the mountain. The entrance was an enormous tunnel mouth wide enough to drive trucks through, cut straight into the rock. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and strangely engineered, ventilated, electrified, organized. And as their flashlights moved along the walls, the soldiers began to understand that this was no ordinary cave. It was a factory hidden inside a mountain, with miles of interlocking tunnels, assembly lines, cranes, and rail tracks. And resting on those tracks in long obedient rows were rockets, not artillery shells, not bombs. Rockets, sleek black and white, 46 feet long, more advanced than anything in the American arsenal. These were the V2s, the weapons that had been falling on London and Antwerp from the edge of space, arriving faster than the sound of their own approach. No warning, no defense. Just a sudden hole in a city street where children had been standing. And here, deep in the rock, the Americans had found where they were born. Take a moment and picture it as they saw it. The cold electric light, the unfinished rockets waiting on the line, as though the workers had simply stepped out and would return at any moment. And in the side tunnels, the bunks, wooden shelves where those workers had slept, if you could call it sleep, the slave laborers who had carved this place out of the mountain by hand and died doing it. Because that was the secret of Mittelwerk. The most advanced machine of its age had been built by the most brutal method imaginable. The rockets and the corpses were two halves of the same invention. The intelligence officers arrived within days, and here the story begins to turn, quietly, the way these stories always seem to turn. The soldiers wanted to know who was responsible. They assumed, reasonably, that the men who had designed these weapons and overseen this place would be hunted, arrested, made to answer for what the camp had been. That is, after all, what the war was supposed to be about. But other men in other uniforms were already asking a different question, not who is guilty, but who is useful. For while the bodies were still being counted at Nordhausen, the lead designer of those rockets was very much alive, comfortable, and waiting. His name was Wernher von Braun. He was 33 years old, and he had no intention of dying in the rubble of the Reich. In the final weeks of the war, von Braun and the core of his rocket team had slipped away from the advancing Soviets and made their way south into the Bavarian Alps. They had not fled to hide. They had fled to be found by the right people. They had carried with them tons of documents, blueprints, and test data, much of it hidden in an abandoned mine shaft. They accumulated genius of more than a decade of work. When von Braun finally arranged his surrender to a young American private in early May, he was reportedly relaxed, almost cheerful. He understood something that the exhausted soldiers in the tunnels did not yet understand. He understood that he was not a prisoner, he was an asset, and so we arrive at the quiet hinge on which this entire story swings. Two truths, sitting side by side, that should not have been able to coexist. The first truth lay in the mountain at Nordhausen, in the tunnels and the bunks and the unmarked graves. The second truth was already being arranged in offices far from the front, in the language of files and clearances and national interest. Within months, The men most closely tied to those tunnels would not be standing trial. They would be on ships and aircraft bound for the United States, for laboratories in Texas, for clean desks and government salaries, and eventually for a place in the story America would tell about itself. But there was a problem, a serious one. American law and a direct order from the President himself forbade bringing committed Nazis into the country. The men they wanted did not qualify, so someone made a decision. Someone decided that the simplest solution was not to choose different men, it was to change the files. The silence did not arrive all at once. That is the first thing to understand. It came the way water finds its level, quietly, inevitably, filling every space where a question might have been asked. In the weeks after Nordhausen, the war ended. Germany surrendered. And across the wreckage of Europe, a vast machinery of accounting began to turn. There were to be trials. There were to be reckonings. The world had seen the camps now, and the world wanted names. But not every name made it onto the lists. And the story of who decided which names disappeared is the heart of what we are tracing tonight. The men who first understood the value of von Braun's team were not generals or politicians. They were intelligence officers and ordnance specialists, practical men with a practical fear. The war against Germany was over, but another shadow was already lengthening across the map. The Soviet Union had its own armies in the same ruins, picking through the same laboratories, capturing the same scientists. And so the question that should have been about justice became, instead, a question about a race. If America did not take these men, the reasoning went, then Stalin would. The rockets that had fallen on London might one day be aimed at New York, and built, this time, in Moscow. You can almost feel how seductive that logic was, how reasonable it must have sounded in a quiet office. Whatever these men had done, surely it was better to have them on our side than on theirs. The program that grew from this reasoning had several names over its life. By late 1945, it was being organized under a body with a deliberately forgettable title, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. But history would come to know the effort by a single quiet word, taken from the paper clips that were fastened to the files of the scientists chosen for a new life. It was called Operation Paperclip. Here is where the orders begin. And here is where you should listen carefully, because the cover-up at the center of this story was not hidden in a tunnel. It was hidden in plain language, on official letterhead. In the autumn of 1945, President Harry Truman approved a program to bring German scientists to the United States. But Truman attached a condition, a line that on paper should have ended the careers of von Braun and many around him before they began. The order specifically excluded anyone who had been a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities, or an active supporter of Nazi militarism. Read that again. More than a nominal participant. Active supporter. The trouble was that the most valuable men were precisely the men the order was meant to exclude. Von Braun had been a party member. He had held a commission in the SS. Others on the list had ties that ran far deeper, into the very tunnels the American soldiers had walked through at Mittelwerk. By the letter of the President's order, they did not qualify. They could not come. And so the men running the program faced a choice. They could obey the order and lose the scientists to the Soviets, or they could keep the scientists and change what the order was looking at. They chose the second path. Quietly. On paper. The mechanism was almost mundane, which is what makes it so unsettling. Each scientist had a dossier, a security report assembling what was known of his past, his affiliations, his conduct under the Reich. These dossiers held the truth, or as much of it as the investigators had gathered, so the dossiers were rewritten. Investigators and officials revised the reports. Damning phrases softened or vanished. A man described in one assessment as an ardent Nazi might be reclassified in a later version as a harmless opportunist who had joined the party only to keep his work. Connections to the SS were minimized. Knowledge of the slave labor that built the rockets was simply left off the page. The historian who later pieced this together found the fingerprints everywhere. Original reports and laundered reports sitting in the same archives, the difference between them written in the careful hand of men deciding what the future would be allowed to know. The practice was common enough that it earned its own grim nickname among those who studied it. The files, they said, had been bleached. Now consider what this means. Slowly, the way it deserves. A government founded on the rule of law had received a lawful order from its elected leader, and rather than break that order openly, rather than argue it or change it through honest channels, a group of officials decided to make the order true on paper while making it false in fact. They did not defy the rules. They forged compliance with them. That is a more sophisticated kind of cover-up than burning a building or burying a body. It does not destroy the evidence. It replaces the evidence with a more convenient version, and then files that version where the truth used to be. And what of the witnesses? What of the men who had walked through Mittelwerk and knew exactly what they had seen? Here the silence did its quietest work. The soldiers moved on, demobilized, scattered back into civilian lives across America. They told their families sometimes what they had found in the mountain. But who would they tell officially, and to what end? The machinery had already decided. The scientists were coming. The story of the tunnels would survive only as private memory, true, but disconnected from the clean public account now taking shape. By 1946, von Braun was in Fort Bliss, Texas. By the years that followed, he and his team would become not war criminals, but pioneers, their names attached not to a mountain full of corpses, but to the conquest of space itself. The bodies at Nordhausen had not been hidden. The rockets had not been hidden. What had been hidden was the line connecting them, and the truth about the men who stood on the far side of it. Which leaves us with the question this part was always building toward. The Soviets, the race, the fear, all of it explains why America wanted the scientists. It does not fully explain why the truth about them had to be erased so carefully and kept erased for so long. Why, exactly, would they hide this? To understand why the truth had to be buried so carefully, we have to step back from the single mountain and the single program and look at the machinery that made such burials possible. Because Operation Paperclip was not an aberration. It was one expression of a pattern, and the pattern is the real subject of tonight's story. Ask yourself a simple question. Who had the power to rewrite those files, and where did that power come from? The answer is not a family or a dynasty. It is something stranger and more durable than any bloodline. It is the institution itself, the permanent apparatus of intelligence and defense that was being born, in those very years, out of the chaos of the war's end. The men who bleached the dossiers were the founding generation of a new American security state, and they were learning in real time that the most useful power of all is the power to decide what the record says. Consider the position they were in. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime spy agency, was being dissolved. Out of its remnants would soon come the Central Intelligence Agency. The armed forces were being reorganized. An entire architecture of secrecy, classification levels, security clearances, need to know, was being constructed almost from scratch. In that moment, an institution learns its own habits. It learns what it can get away with. And what these institutions learned in 1945 and 1946 was that a sufficiently important goal could justify almost any quiet adjustment to the truth. This is the deeper history beneath Paperclip, and it is documented, not imagined. Von Braun's team was never the only group of useful Germans absorbed into the West rather than judged by it. There was, for instance, a man named Reinhard Gehlen. He had run Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front. When the war ended, he too understood the value of what he carried: files, networks, agents inside the Soviet sphere. And so he too was not tried, but recruited. His organization, staffed in part by former Nazi officers, was folded into American intelligence and eventually became the foundation of West Germany's own spy service. The enemy of yesterday became the asset of today, and the paperwork was made to agree. There were others. There were the so-called rat lines, the escape routes by which wanted men slipped out of Europe, sometimes with the quiet knowledge, even assistance, of intelligence services who found certain fugitives useful. Years later it would emerge that a man named Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo officer known as the Butcher of Leon, had been employed by American counterintelligence after the war and helped to vanish when the French came looking. In 1983, the United States government formally apologized to France for it. The apology is real. You can read it. Do you see the shape forming? It is not one cover-up. It is a method. The method works like this. First, a goal is declared so important. Winning the Cold War, beating the Soviets to the rocket, to the bomb, to the secrets, that ordinary rules are quietly suspended in its name. Second, the men who could embarrass that goal are not eliminated but absorbed, their pasts edited rather than examined. Third, and most important, the editing itself is concealed, so that the public is left with a clean story and no visible seam. This is how institutions rewrite their own origins. Not by lying outright, which can be caught, but by curating, by deciding which documents are filed, which are destroyed, which are reclassified, and which are gently revised until they say something a citizen can comfortably believe. And here we should be honest with each other, you and I, because this is where it would be easy to lose our footing. It is tempting, when you see a pattern this clear, to keep pulling the thread until it explains everything, to imagine a single hidden hand behind all of history, a grand suppressed truth that the powerful have spent centuries erasing. You will find no shortage of voices online who will offer you exactly that. Lost civilizations, buried worlds, whole eras supposedly scrubbed from the record by the same shadowy will. I want to be careful here, because that is precisely the trap this kind of story sets. The honest power of Operation Paperclip is that it is real, documented in declassified files, confirmed by the government's own later admissions, reconstructed by historians from the bleached dossiers themselves. It does not need to be inflated into a theory of everything. The moment we reach for the unprovable, we lose the one thing that makes this account dangerous to the official story. It is true, and it can be shown to be true. So let us hold to the evidence, and let the evidence be enough. It is more than enough. What the documented pattern tells us is sobering on its own terms. It tells us that the historical record is not a fixed and neutral thing. It is maintained by institutions, and institutions have interests. They decide what is preserved and what is allowed to decay. And when their interests and the truth diverge, it is not always the interests that give way. That is the larger frame around our mountain. The men who walked into Mittelwerk in April of 1945 saw something true. The men who built the files in the months after decided that a different version would serve the country better. And for decades, the different version held. Which brings us back, as it must, to the rockets in the tunnel, and to the question that still has no comfortable answer. We know that the files were rewritten. We know who did it, and roughly how. What remains genuinely contested, what believers and skeptics still argue over to this day, is something harder. How much did the men we honored actually know about what happened in those tunnels? How much did the men who cleared them know that they knew? That is not a question of conspiracy. It is a question of evidence, and it is where we turn next. So let us do now what the men who bleached the files hoped no one ever would. Let us lay the evidence on the table, all of it, and look at the scene where the clean story and the true story refuse to meet. Start with the physical facts, because they are not in dispute. Mittelwerk was real. The tunnels were real. The slave laborers were real, and their numbers are documented. Of the roughly 60,000 prisoners who passed through the Dora camp system, an estimated 20,000 died, worked, starved, beaten, or hanged to death in the production of the rockets. More people died building the V2 than were ever killed by it as a weapon. That sentence is worth sitting with. The machine consumed more lives in its making than in its use. These figures come not from rumor, but from post-war investigation, from the camp's own records, from the testimony of survivors who lived to describe the bunks and the roll calls and the bodies on the tunnel floor. The contested question is narrower and far more uncomfortable. Not did it happen, but what did the men we later honored know about it, and when? Here is the case the believers make, and they make it strongly. Wernher von Braun, they point out, was not a distant figure. He was the technical director of the rocket program. He visited Mittelwerk. By his own later admission, he was present in the tunnels and saw the conditions there with his own eyes. There exists a letter written by von Braun in 1944 in which he discusses traveling to a concentration camp to select prisoners with particular skills for the labor force. A man who selected slave laborers, the believers argue, cannot also be a man who knew nothing. The clean post-war image, the visionary dreamer who only ever wanted to reach the stars, who was a Nazi merely on paper, collapses against that letter. The files were bleached precisely because the unbleached truth was damning. They did not rewrite the record to hide a small thing, and it was not only von Braun. Arthur Rudolph, the operations director at Mittelwerk, the man who ran the production line itself, he too came to America under Paperclip, worked on the Saturn V rocket that carried men toward the moon, and received honors for it. Decades later, in the early 1980s, the evidence of his role at Mittelwerk had grown heavy enough that he agreed to leave the United States and renounce his citizenship rather than face proceedings over his wartime conduct. That happened. It is on the record. The believers ask, reasonably, why would an innocent man do that? Now hear the skeptics, because they too have a real case, and fairness demands we give it its full weight. Knowledge, the skeptics say, is not the same as guilt. To have seen the conditions in the tunnels, even to have selected laborers, was, under the machinery of the Reich, the ordinary circumstance of nearly every German engineer in a wartime industry. Almost the entire German economy ran on coerced labor by 1944. To have functioned within that system is not the same as to have designed its cruelty. Von Braun, the skeptics note, also claimed that he had no power to change the conditions, that protest would have meant his own arrest, that he was an engineer trapped inside a murderous state, not an architect of its murders. He told interviewers he was sickened by what he saw and powerless to stop it. We cannot prove that claim false. We cannot read the inside of a dead man's conscience. And the skeptics make a sharper point still, one that turns the whole story back on the people who later sat in judgment. If we condemn von Braun for working within an evil system because his work was useful to that system, then what do we say about the Americans who knowingly cleared him, honored him, and built their space program on his expertise? The bleaching of the files was not done by von Braun. It was done by the men who wanted him. The deepest guilt, the skeptics argue, may lie less with the asset than with those who chose to launder him, and who taught a young agency that the truth was something it could edit. Do you feel how the ground refuses to settle beneath you? Because here is the difficulty, stated plainly. The conventional explanation, the gentle post-war story of reform dreamers who knew little and meant well, clearly fails. The 1944 Lesser alone breaks it. The bleached dossiers prove that someone, at the time, believed the truth was too dangerous to keep on the page. But the opposite explanation, that these were simply monsters, knowing and willing, does not quite close either, because the system that surrounded them was so total, so coercive, that the line between participation and complicity blurs into something genuinely hard to measure, and because the men who judged them were not clean either. We are left, then, not with an answer but with a calibrated uncertainty. We know the files were rewritten. We know the men had more knowledge than the clean story allowed. What we cannot finally settle, what honest historians still argue, is how to weigh knowledge against coercion, usefulness against justice, the asset against the men who edited him into respectability. That is not a gap a conspiracy can fill. It is a gap in the human record, the kind that opens whenever power decides that some truths are too inconvenient to keep and quietly files a better version in their place. And so we come to the last and largest question, not what these particular men knew, but what it means that we chose to forget. Step back now, all the way back, and let the mountain shrink behind us until it is only one dark point on a vast map. Because the story of Operation Paperclip was never really about rockets. It was about a choice, and the choice is one that every nation, and perhaps every person, eventually faces. The choice is this: when the truth is inconvenient and a more comfortable version is available, which one do we file? America made its choice in 1945. It chose the comfortable version. It chose the dreamers over the tunnels, the conquest of space over the accounting of the dead, and for a long time that choice worked exactly as intended. A generation grew up watching the Saturn V rise on its pillar of fire, and almost none of them knew that the man who built it had once written a letter about selecting slaves from a concentration camp. So let us ask slowly what it means if this story is true. Because in its essential outline it is true. That part is not in question. It means that the history you were taught is not the whole history. It means that the clean accounts in the textbooks were, in places, curated by people with reasons to curate them. It means that progress and atrocity can share a single author, and that nations will sometimes choose the progress and quietly bury the author's other half. If this story is true, then the record itself is not a mirror. It is a portrait painted by interested hands, and we are only ever seeing the version someone decided we should see. But let us also ask the harder, fairer question. What does it mean if we have it wrong? If the darkest reading is unjust? It means that we should be careful with the dead, who cannot answer us. It means that coercion is real, that the moral arithmetic of a totalitarian state is not the arithmetic of a free one, and that it is easy, from the safety of decades later, to condemn men whose choices we never had to make. It means that the same hunger for a hidden truth that lets us see the bleached files clearly can also tempt us to see villains where they were only frightened, compromised, ordinary people. The honest answer is that both cautions are true at once, and we must hold them both. And here is the thing that should stay with you longest. The story survived anyway. It survived because soldiers told their families what they smelled in the hills above Nordhausen. It survived because survivors of Dora refused to let their 20,000 dead be erased by the convenience of the living. It survived because one historian went looking for the original files and found them sitting beside the bleached ones, the truth and its edited twin, preserved together by the very bureaucracy that tried to choose between them. It survived because France remembered Klaus Barbie and demanded an apology and got one. That is the quiet hope buried inside this dark account. Suppression is powerful, but it is rarely perfect. The record can be edited, but the people who witnessed it are harder to rewrite. Memory leaks, files surface. Someone, eventually, goes looking, and the buried version and the official version are laid side by side, and we are left to judge. That is what this channel is for in the end. Not to hand you a verdict, but to lay the two versions side by side and let you look. If this is the kind of looking you value, the slow kind, the patient kind, the kind that refuses both the comfortable lie and the thrilling fantasy, then stay with us. Subscribe so the next buried story finds its way to you. And if you carry a piece of this history yourself, a grandfather who walked into those tunnels, a name your family remembers differently than the textbooks do, leave it in the comments below. The oral history is how these things survived. It is how they will keep surviving. Because the files were rewritten, yes, but the mountain is still there. The tunnels are still there, cut into the Konstein, cold and quiet and open to anyone willing to walk in and remember. And somewhere in an archive, the original report still sits beside the bleached one, two versions of the same man, waiting for someone to decide which one is true.